18-year-old Shaylyn Moran was in a relationship at some point with one of Smith's sons. Authority was charged with 3 misdemeanors and 4 felonies, including first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder.
Shaylyn Moran was just 18 years old when she accepted a marriage proposal at a New Year's Eve party in 2019. Her fiancé, Jack Doherty, had traveled all the way from New York to meet her in person for the first time after months of long-distance romance. It should have been the beginning of a fairy tale. A young couple in love, an engagement, a future full of possibilities. But just hours after the champagne stopped flowing and the clock struck midnight on January 1st, 2020, this teenage couple would commit a murder so cold-blooded, so calculated, that would shock the state of Rhode Island and reveal that their love story was actually a conspiracy to kill. The victim wasn't a rival, wasn't a threat, wasn't involved in their relationship at all. She was a 54-year-old mother who simply had the misfortune of answering her own front door on New Year's. Her only crime was being the mother of Shaylyn's ex-boyfriend. And for that, Shaylyn Moran and Jack Doherty decided she had to die. This is the shocking true story of how a teenage girl turned her online boyfriend into a hired killer, how a New Year's engagement became a murder pact, and how an innocent woman was gunned down on her own doorstep because a jealous ex-girlfriend couldn't let go. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and notification bell, because this case will show you that some of the most dangerous criminals in America aren't hardened career criminals. They're teenagers whose obsessive relationships turn deadly. Shaylyn Moran was born and raised in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, a working-class city just north of Providence. In October 2019, at just 18 years old, Shaylyn met 21-year-old Leonard Truefield III online. Like millions of other young people, she turned to the internet to find connection, friendship, and romance. What started as an online conversation quickly escalated into an in-person relationship that would reveal the darkest aspects of Shaylyn's personality. Within just 4 days of meeting Leonard in person, Shaylyn became utterly obsessed with him. This wasn't the normal excitement of a new relationship or the typical intensity of young love. This was something far more dangerous. Her fixation on Leonard was immediate, all-consuming, and completely overwhelming. When Leonard recognized the unhealthy nature of her obsession and ended the relationship after just days together, Shaylyn's response revealed a young woman with serious psychological issues and a complete inability to accept rejection. Enraged by Leonard's decision to break up with her, Shaylyn's behavior became increasingly erratic and dangerous. She threatened her own life in desperate attempts to manipulate Leonard into staying with her, putting a knife to her own throat in front of him. When that didn't work, she jumped out of a window, a dramatic and dangerous gesture designed to force Leonard to focus on her and rescind his decision to end their brief relationship. But when threats of self-harm failed to achieve her desired result, Shaylyn's rage turned outward. She began threatening to kill Leonard himself, making it clear that if she couldn't have him, nobody would. Her threats didn't stop with Leonard. She specifically threatened to kill his mother, 54-year-old Cheryl Smith, a beloved teacher's assistant at the Heritage Park YMCA in Pawtucket, where she had worked for 4 years caring for hundreds of local children. Cheryl Smith was everything that Shaylyn Moran was not: stable, kind, hardworking, and genuinely loved by her community. She had dedicated the past 4 years to working with children at the YMCA's Child Care Center, where she was remembered as a patient, caring educator who treated every child in her care with kindness and respect. She was also a licensed real estate agent with Sotheby's International Realty in Boston, balancing 2 careers while remaining devoted to her family. According to her obituary, Cheryl enjoyed music, traveling the world with her brother, and most of all, she loved being a mother to her boys. Shaylyn's threats against Cheryl became increasingly specific and terrifying. She didn't just threaten Leonard's mother in abstract terms. She threatened to shoot up the YMCA, where Cheryl worked, potentially endangering not just Cheryl, but dozens of innocent children and co-workers. Leonard took these threats seriously and reported them to police, desperately trying to protect his mother and the people she worked with from his violently obsessive ex-girlfriend. But despite Leonard's reports to law enforcement, nothing was done. No charges were filed. No protective measures were put in place. The threats that Shaylyn had made, threats that would prove to be deadly serious, were apparently not considered actionable by the authorities who received them. This failure to take her threats seriously would have catastrophic consequences just months later. In a twisted turn of events, Shaylyn took her manipulation to the next level. A few weeks after threatening Leonard and his mother, she called police herself and accused Leonard of assaulting her. In October 2019, Leonard was arrested on 3 domestic violence charges based on Shaylyn's accusations. He was issued a no-contact order and faced pending criminal charges. Shaylyn filed for a restraining order against the man she had been threatening to kill, attempting to use the legal system as a weapon against him. Detective Sergeant Christopher LaFord of the Pawtucket Major Crime Squad would later describe the relationship between Moran and Truefield as rocky and volatile, with each claiming violence against each other. However, the charges against Leonard were eventually dropped due to lack of evidence, and the restraining order Shaylyn had sought was denied. The legal system had apparently recognized that Shaylyn's accusations were unfounded, but by then, she had already moved on to an even more dangerous plan. By December 2019, just weeks after her breakup with Leonard and her failed attempts to have him arrested, Shaylyn had found a new boyfriend, Jack Doherty from Albany, New York. The two had been talking online for only 3 weeks when Doherty decided to travel from New York to Rhode Island to meet Shaylyn in person the first time. But this wasn't a typical first meeting between young people who had connected online. Doherty came to Rhode Island with a very specific purpose, and he brought along the tool he would need to carry it out. According to prosecutors and evidence presented at trial, in the months before the murder, even while Shaylyn was still trying to manipulate Leonard through threats and false accusations, she had been developing her long-distance relationship with Doherty. Their conversations on social media and over the phone weren't just about normal relationship topics. They were conspiring together to attack Leonard Truefield. Court documents and testimony would later reveal the chilling content of these communications. On December 28, 2019, just days before Doherty's planned visit to Rhode Island, Shaylyn sent him a Facebook message that revealed the extent of their planning. "When I leave for Maine, where her mother lives, I'm gonna need you to hit up Leonard so I can stain and then switch the state." The meaning was clear to investigators. Shaylyn wanted Doherty to hit up, attack, or kill Leonard so that she could flee to Maine and establish an alibi by being in another state when the violence occurred. This message alone demonstrated premeditation and conspiracy, showing that Shaylyn had been planning violence against Leonard for weeks or months before the actual murder occurred. The next day, Doherty responded to Shaylyn's plans in another Facebook message. According to Judge Kristen Rogers' later summary from the bench, Doherty asked Shaylyn if her plan to move to Maine was because she has a beef and then offered to pull up and kill that person today. Doherty's willingness to murder a complete stranger simply because his online girlfriend had beef with him reveals the toxic and dangerous nature of their relationship. On December 31st, 2019, New Year's Eve, Jack Doherty traveled from Albany, New York to Pawtucket, Rhode Island to meet Shaylyn Moran in person for the first time. He didn't come empty-handed. Doherty brought with him a 9mm ghost gun pistol, an untraceable firearm that later investigation would reveal appeared to be 3D printed, according to Detective Sergeant Christopher LaFord, who told reporters it was the first one I've seen used in a crime. A ghost gun is a particularly sinister choice of weapon. These firearms are assembled from kits or 3D printed parts and lack serial numbers, making them virtually untraceable by law enforcement. The fact that Doherty traveled across state lines with such a weapon, bringing it specifically for his first in-person meeting with Shaylyn, demonstrates clear premeditation, and this wasn't a gun he happened to own. This wasn't a weapon he brought for self-defense. This was a murder weapon, selected and obtained for a specific purpose that he and Shaylyn had discussed during their online conversations. Upon arriving in Rhode Island, Doherty and Moran rented a room at the Hampton Inn on George Street in Pawtucket. They checked into the hotel together, this young couple meeting face-to-face for the first time, carrying with them a plan to commit murder. That evening, they left their hotel room and attended a New Year's Eve party, where they celebrated the arrival of 2020 along with other friends and acquaintances. At the party, in what should have been a romantic gesture celebrating their new relationship, Jack Doherty proposed marriage to Shaylyn Moran. She accepted, and the newly engaged couple celebrated as the clock struck midnight and 2020 began. To everyone at that party, they probably seemed like any other young couple in love, excited, affectionate, planning their future together. Nobody could have imagined that this engagement was actually the sealing of a murder pact, or that within hours, this newly engaged couple would carry out the brutal killing they had been planning for weeks. After the party ended and the New Year's celebrations died down, Doherty and Moran returned to their hotel room. There, in the early hours of January 1st, 2020, they finalized their plan. According to prosecutors and evidence presented at trial, the couple developed a specific strategy. Doherty would go to the home on Baxter Street where Leonard Truefield lived, and he would shoot and kill anyone who answered the door. Think about the cold calculation behind this plan. They didn't care whether it would be Leonard himself who answered the door, or his mother, or anyone else who might have been visiting the family. The plan was simply to kill whoever appeared when Doherty knocked, an indiscriminate murder designed to hurt Leonard regardless of who actually died. This level of callousness and disregard for human life is difficult to comprehend, particularly coming from two people so young. The choice of victim, or rather, the lack of a specific victim, reveals something particularly disturbing about Shaylyn Moran's psychology. This wasn't a targeted assassination of Leonard Truefield based on some perceived wrong he had done to her. This was terrorism directed at Leonard through the murder of someone connected to him. Shaylyn wanted Leonard to suffer the loss of someone he loved, to feel the pain and trauma of having a family member murdered, because he had rejected her obsessive advances. On the evening of January 1st, 2020, following Shaylyn's instructions, Jack Doherty left the Hampton Inn and traveled to 100 Baxter Street, the home where Leonard Truefield lived with his mother, Cheryl Smith. Doherty didn't simply walk up to the door and knock. According to prosecutors, he first surveilled the home, watching and waiting, perhaps trying to determine who might be inside or looking for the best moment to carry out the attack. After completing his surveillance, Doherty walked up to the front door of the residence, and it was approximately 8:15 p.m. on New Year's Day, a time when most families would be relaxing at home, recovering from the previous night's celebrations, spending quiet time together at the start of a new year. Inside the home, Cheryl Smith heard the knock on her door. Cheryl had no reason to fear answering her own front door. She had no way of knowing that the young man on the other side was there because her son's ex-girlfriend, someone she may have never even met, had recruited him to commit murder. She had no idea that her son Leonard was upstairs in the house, safe and alive, while she walked toward the door that would be the last thing she ever opened. When Cheryl Smith opened her front door on that New Year's Day evening, Jack Doherty raised his 9mm ghost gun pistol and opened fire. He shot Cheryl 4 times, striking her multiple times in the chest. The gunshots rang out in the residential neighborhood, shattering the peace of New Year's Day and sending Cheryl falling in her own doorway. Doherty didn't check to see if his victim was the intended target. He didn't ask her name or verify her identity. He simply fired 4 shots into the woman who had answered the door, exactly as he and Shaylyn had planned. After shooting Cheryl Smith, Doherty fled the scene, leaving her bleeding on the threshold of her own home. Inside the house, Leonard Truefield heard the gunshots. He rushed to the front door and found his mother shot and dying. The young man who had tried desperately to warn police about his ex-girlfriend's threats, who had reported Shaylyn's promise to kill his mother, was now facing the nightmare he had feared. His mother, the person Shaylyn had specifically threatened, had been shot multiple times in what was clearly a targeted attack. Emergency responders were called immediately. First responders rushed to the scene and found Cheryl Smith with numerous gunshot wounds to her chest. They transported her to Rhode Island Hospital, working frantically to save her life. But the injuries were too severe, the damage too extensive. Cheryl Smith was pronounced dead at the hospital, becoming Rhode Island's first murder victim of 2020, killed just hours into the new year by a stranger who had been sent to her door by her son's obsessive ex-girlfriend. When police arrived at the scene and began their investigation, Leonard Truefield immediately told them who he believed was responsible. He showed officers screenshots of threatening text messages from Shaylyn Moran, including one that read, "I'll kill you." He explained the history of their brief, volatile relationship, Shaylyn's obsessive behavior after their breakup, her specific threats against his mother and the YMCA where she worked, and her more recent relationship with Jack Doherty. Leonard's immediate identification of Shaylyn as a suspect proved crucial to the rapid resolution of the case. Detectives from the Pawtucket Police Department already had a strong lead just hours after the murder, and they moved quickly to gather evidence and locate the suspects. Investigators obtained search warrants for Shaylyn Moran's and Jack Doherty's cell phones, social media accounts, and rideshare service accounts. What they discovered in these digital records would prove devastating to the defendants and would reveal the full extent of their planning and their complete lack of remorse for what they had. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from the suspect's own social media posts, made just hours after murdering Cheryl Smith. At approximately 10 p.m., less than 2 hours after Cheryl was killed, Jack Doherty posted a photograph on Facebook that would shock investigators and the community. The photo showed Doherty and Moran together in bed at their Hampton Inn hotel room. Moran was displaying her engagement ring prominently in front of her face, which featured a tattoo of the crosshairs of a gun scope, a chilling detail that took on even more sinister meaning in light of the murder they had just committed. But it was the caption on the photo that truly revealed their depravity. "We some fighters and some shooters." They were bragging. Less than 2 hours after murdering a 54-year-old mother and teacher in her own door, this newly engaged couple was posting on social media to boast about what they had done. The phrase, "we some fighters and some shooters," was a clear reference to the shooting, a celebration of their violence, a public declaration of what they had accomplished. At 10 p.m., a Pawtucket detective who was still at the shooting scene at 100 Baxter Street was monitoring social media for any leads in the case. When he saw Doherty's Facebook photo with its caption, he immediately recognized its significance. The photo had been posted from a location that could be traced, and the brazen nature of the post suggested that the suspects felt confident they wouldn't be caught. By 10:30 p.m., just 30 minutes after seeing the incriminating social media post, officers were outside the Hampton Inn where Doherty and Moran were staying. The speed of the investigation, from murder to arrest, was remarkable. Just hours after killing Cheryl Smith, her murderers were in custody. Officers approached the hotel room and prepared to make their arrest. When Doherty and Moran exited their hotel room, police moved in to apprehend them. According to reports, Doherty resisted arrest and rushed at Detective Justin Gould, who took him down to the ground. This assault on a police officer would add another charge to the growing list Doherty faced. When officers searched Doherty, they made a crucial discovery. He was still in possession of the 9mm ghost gun pistol he had used to kill Cheryl Smith. The murder weapon was found in a holstered position in Doherty's backpack, along with an extra magazine of bullets. He had kept the gun with him rather than disposing of it, another indication of the arrogance and poor judgment that had led him to post about the murder on social media just hours after But the evidence recovered from the suspects went beyond just the murder weapon. Minutes after the killing, while Doherty was fleeing the scene, he had sent a Snapchat message to Moran from a Lyft rideshare vehicle. The message read, "Now this is for life." The meaning was clear. By killing Cheryl Smith, Doherty had proven his loyalty and commitment to Moran in the most extreme way possible. He had murdered a complete stranger, crossed state lines with an illegal firearm, and committed one of the most serious crimes possible, all to prove his love for a girl he had just met in person for the first time the previous day. Moran's response to Doherty's message was equally chilling. She replied with a heart emoji and words of endearment. "I'm yours forever and you mine." She wasn't expressing horror at what had been done. She wasn't showing remorse for the role she had played in orchestrating a murder. She was celebrating their bond, cemented through the blood of an innocent woman who had never done anything to evil. The digital evidence recovered from their phones and social media accounts painted a complete picture of premeditation, conspiracy, and celebration of murder. The Facebook messages from late December showing their planning. The Snapchat messages immediately after the murder showing their lack of remorse. The Facebook photo bragging about being shooters just hours after killing Cheryl Smith. Every piece of evidence demonstrated that this wasn't a crime of passion or a tragic mistake. It was a calculated murder carried out according to plan, followed by celebration and boasting. Shaylyn Moran and Jack Doherty were arrested on January 2nd, 2020, just one day after murdering Cheryl Smith, and held without bail. They were arraigned on January 3rd, 2020, at District Court in Providence. Doherty faced 7 charges, including first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, discharge of a firearm when committing a crime of violence, carrying a pistol without a permit, and assaulting Detective Justin Gould during his arrest. Moran was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and carrying a pistol without a license. Although she had not personally pulled the trigger, prosecutors made clear that she was equally culpable for Cheryl Smith's death. She had recruited Doherty. She had conspired with him to commit the murder. She had provided him with the target. She had instructed him to go to the house and kill whoever answered the door. Under the law, someone who plans and orchestrates a murder is just as guilty as the person who physically carries it out. At their arraignment, neither defendant entered a plea. They were ordered held without bail at the adult correctional institutions pending further proceedings. A bail hearing was scheduled for January 16, 2020, but given the severity of the charges and the overwhelming evidence against them, there was little chance either defendant would be released pending trial. The news of Cheryl Smith's murder and the arrest of her killers spread quickly through Pawtucket and the surrounding communities. People were shocked that such a calculated murder had occurred in their city and horrified by the social media posts that showed the young couple bragging about what they had done. The Heritage Park YMCA, where Cheryl had worked for 4 years, released a statement expressing their tremendous sorrow for the senseless tragedy. CEO Charlie Clifford sent a letter to families saying that Cheryl was a beloved member of the community and our child care team and reached hundreds of children during her tenure with us. Parents whose children had been cared for by Cheryl remembered her kindness, patience, and genuine love for the children in her care. Co-workers remembered her as reliable, dedicated, and always willing to help others. Friends and family members struggled to comprehend that someone so good, so caring, so innocent had been murdered in such a brutal and senseless way. Cheryl's cousin, Robert Gruslin Jr., would later speak in court about his love for her. She had a kind heart and always cared about people near and dear to her, Gruslin said. They always say that cousins are your first friends. This was true with my family. His words captured the deep loss felt by everyone who had known Cheryl and the permanent void her death had created in their lives. The Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence issued a statement regarding the murder, noting the connection between domestic violence dynamics and the targeted killing of a family member. While Cheryl herself had not been in a domestic violence situation, her murder was the direct result of her son's ex-girlfriend's inability to accept the end of their relationship, a dynamic that appears in many domestic violence cases. As the legal proceedings moved forward, the evidence against Moran and Doherty continued to mount. In addition to the physical evidence, the murder weapon, the social media posts, the text messages, prosecutors had Doherty's own statements made during the investigation. The case against both defendants was overwhelming. Shaylyn Moran's case proceeded first. Facing life in prison if convicted at trial, and recognizing the strength of the evidence against her, Moran decided to accept a plea agreement with prosecutors. On August 5, 2021, more than a year and a half after murdering Cheryl Smith, Moran appeared in Providence County Superior Court before Justice Kristen E. Rogers. At age 20, having spent the past year and a half in jail awaiting trial, Shaylyn Moran pleaded guilty to charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and carrying a pistol without a license. By pleading guilty, she admitted her responsibility for orchestrating Cheryl Smith's murder and accepted the consequences of her actions. Justice Rogers sentenced Moran to life in prison for the murder charge, plus 2 consecutive 10-year sentences for carrying a pistol without a license and conspiracy to commit murder, a total sentence of life plus 20 years. This meant that Moran would spend the rest of her natural life behind bars, with no possibility of parole. She entered the prison system as a 20-year-old and will remain there until she dies. In imposing this sentence, Justice Rogers emphasized the calculated nature of the crime and the complete innocence of the victim. Cheryl Smith had done nothing wrong, had never harmed Moran, had simply been the mother of a young man who had briefly dated Moran and then wisely ended the relationship. For that offense, Moran had orchestrated her murder, recruited a boyfriend she had just met to carry it out, and then celebrated the killing on social media. Rhode Island Attorney General Peter Noronha stated, Cases such as these are devastating for the victim and difficult for the community. Cheryl's life, like so many others, was taken senselessly and much too soon. His words acknowledged both the specific tragedy of Cheryl's murder and the broader impact of such violence on the entire community. With Moran's case resolved, attention turned to Jack Doherty's prosecution. Unlike Moran, Doherty initially chose to fight the charges and take his case to trial. His defense team raised an insanity defense, arguing that Doherty suffered from mental illness that had impaired his ability to understand the nature and consequences of his actions. Doherty's trial took place in November 2022, nearly 3 years after the murder. The 8-day trial before Justice Kristen Rogers featured testimony from numerous witnesses, forensic experts, and mental health professionals. Prosecutors presented the overwhelming evidence of Doherty's guilt. The murder weapon found in his possession, the social media posts bragging about the killing, the text messages with Moran planning the attack, the eyewitness accounts, and the forensic evidence linking him to the crime. The prosecution also presented particularly damning evidence about the couple's behavior immediately after the murder. Assistant Attorney General Stephen Dambruch told the court about a photograph that Doherty had taken of himself and Moran in bed after the killing. In the photo, Moran was holding up 4 fingers, the exact same number of shots that he fired at and killed Cheryl Smith with, Dambruch explained. Doherty had captioned the photo, "We some fighters and some shooters." He's boasting about taking a life, Dambruch said, emphasizing the complete lack of remorse shown by both defendants. The defense presented expert testimony about Doherty's mental health. Multiple forensic psychiatrists testified that Doherty suffered from PTSD, substance use disorder, and either bipolar type 1 disorder or schizophrenia. The defense argued that these mental illnesses had impaired Doherty's judgment and that he should be found not guilty by reason of insanity. However, the prosecution successfully rebutted the insanity defense. They argued that while Doherty may have suffered from mental illness, he clearly understood the nature of his actions and knew they were wrong. The evidence of premeditation, traveling from New York with a gun, surveilling the home, planning the attack with Moran, fleeing the scene, and then bragging about it on social media, all demonstrated that Doherty was capable of planning, executing, and covering up his crime. These were not the actions of someone who was legally insane. On November 15, 2022, after 8 days of trial, the jury returned their verdict. They found Jack Doherty guilty on all charges: 1 count of murder, 1 count of discharge of a firearm when committing a crime of violence, 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder, and 1 count of carrying a pistol without a permit. The guilty verdicts were unanimous, reflecting the jury's conclusion that the evidence against Doherty was overwhelming and that his mental illness, while real, did not rise to the level of legal insanity that would excuse his actions. Doherty was remanded to custody at the adult correctional institutions to await sentencing. His conviction on all charges meant he faced the possibility of life in prison without parole, similar to the sentence that had been imposed on his co-defendant Shaylyn Moran. The sentencing hearing for Jack Doherty took place on March 28, 2023, more than 3 years after he had murdered Cheryl Smith. Now, 27 years old, Doherty stood before Justice Kristen Rogers to learn his fate. Justice Rogers was scathing in her assessment of Doherty's crimes. It is not difficult to appreciate the severity of the crimes for which the defendant is convicted, she said from the bench. A hardworking, much-loved, caring member of the community, completely innocent, relaxing at her home, answers her front door on New Year's Day and is gunned down. Rogers emphasized how a multitude of steps had been taken by Doherty and Moran to carry out this senseless act of violence, both before and after the murder. The premeditation, the conspiracy, the cold-blooded execution of the plan, and the celebration afterward all demonstrated a level of depravity that warranted severe punishment. However, Justice Rogers also acknowledged the expert testimony about Doherty's mental illness. She pointed out that the forensic psychiatrists who had testified during the trial had all agreed that Doherty suffered from PTSD, substance use disorder, and either bipolar type 1 or schizophrenia, though they differed on the exact diagnosis. It is for this reason, that being the defendant's noted mental illness, albeit different diagnosis from forensic psychiatrists, that this court concludes it would be excessive to sentence the defendant to the maximum jail time that the state requests, Rogers explained. The prosecution had asked for the maximum possible sentence, arguing that Doherty could not be rehabilitated and deserved to spend the rest of his life in prison. But Justice Rogers disagreed with the prosecution's assessment. The state believes that the defendant cannot be rehabilitated, thereby asking for the maximum penalty. "I don't agree," she said. Rogers expressed her belief that with psychiatric treatment, rehabilitation is possible over the course of the very lengthy sentence that he is still required to serve. Justice Rogers sentenced Jack Doherty to 2 consecutive life sentences plus 5 additional years. While technically not the maximum sentence that could have been imposed, this was still an extraordinarily severe punishment that ensured Doherty would spend decades, likely the rest of his life, in prison for his role in murdering Cheryl Smith. Rhode Island Attorney General Peter Noronha responded to the sentencing with a statement acknowledging both the justice that had been served and the permanent loss suffered by Cheryl's family. "The punishment handed down today will not return Cheryl to her family and friends, but it is my hope that this significant sentence will bring them a measure of justice," Noronha said. Assistant Attorney General Stephen Dambruch, who had prosecuted the case, emphasized the calculated nature of the crime in his statements to the press. "This was nothing less than a cold and ruthless taking of a human life," Dambruch said, summarizing the prosecution's view of Doherty's actions. "The case of Shaylyn Moran and Jack Doherty forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about teenage relationships in the digital age, the dangers of obsessive love, and the catastrophic consequences that can result when violent fantasies are validated rather than challenged. The story of how an 18-year-old girl's inability to accept a breakup led to the murder of an innocent woman serves as a stark warning about the importance of recognizing warning signs and taking threats seriously. The psychological profile of Shaylyn Moran presents a disturbing case study in obsessive behavior and manipulation. Her immediate fixation on Leonard Truefield after just 4 days together, her dramatic threats of self-harm when he ended the relationship, her escalation to threats against Leonard and his family, and finally her recruitment of a new boyfriend to carry out murder on her behalf. All of these demonstrate a progression from unhealthy attachment to deadly violence. What makes Moran's case particularly chilling is her age at the time of the crime. At just 18 years old, she was barely an adult, yet she demonstrated a level of manipulation and moral emptiness that is rare even among adult criminals. Her ability to convince Jack Doherty, someone she had only been talking to online for 3 weeks, to travel from New York with a gun and murder a complete stranger demonstrates either extraordinary persuasive abilities or Doherty's own deep psychological problems, or both. The fact that Moran and Doherty bragged about the murder on social media immediately after committing it reveals something particularly disturbing about their psychology. Most criminals who commit premeditated murder try to hide their involvement, destroy evidence, and create alibis. But Moran and Doherty posted photos and captions celebrating what they had done, apparently believing that their crime made them gangster or worthy of admiration. This complete disconnect from the moral reality of murder, this inability to recognize that taking an innocent life was not an accomplishment, but a horrific crime, suggests a level of moral emptiness that is difficult to comprehend. The impact of their crime on Cheryl Smith's family cannot be overstated. Leonard Truefield not only lost his mother to violence, but he lost her because of his brief relationship with Shaylyn Moran. He had tried to warn police about Moran's threats. He had reported her promise to kill his mother, but his warnings were not taken seriously, and his worst fears came to pass. The guilt and trauma of losing his mother in this way, combined with the knowledge that her death was directly connected to his past relationship, will affect him for the rest of his life. Cheryl's extended family, her co-workers at the YMCA, and the entire Pawtucket community also suffered from the loss of a woman who had dedicated her life to caring for children and serving others. The hundreds of children who had been in Cheryl's care at the YMCA lost a teacher who had treated them with kindness and patience. The community lost a hard-working, caring member who had contributed positively to society in multiple ways. The case also raises important questions about how law enforcement and the justice system respond to threats made by individuals in the context of volatile relationships. Leonard Truefield had reported Moran's threats to kill him and his mother. He had shown police text messages that said, "I'll kill you." But these threats were apparently not considered actionable at the time, and no protective measures were put in place. When Moran's threats became reality and Cheryl Smith was murdered, it represented a failure of the system to protect a potential victim even when clear warnings had been provided. The dynamic between Shaylyn Moran and Jack Doherty also illustrates the dangers of online relationships, particularly when they involve individuals with poor judgment, violent ideation, or obsessive tendencies. Their entire relationship developed in a digital space where it was easy for them to share and validate each other's darkest thoughts without the moderating influence of real-world interaction or the involvement of friends and family who might have recognized the dangerous nature of their connection. The fact that they went from first meeting in person to committing murder together in less than 24 hours demonstrates how their online relationship had created an intensity and commitment that would have been impossible in a traditional dating scenario. They had bonded over plans to hurt Leonard Truefield during their weeks of online communication. And when they finally met face-to-face, they carried out those plans almost immediately. The use of a ghost gun, a 3D-printed, untraceable firearm, in this crime also highlights emerging challenges for law enforcement. Detective Sergeant Christopher Lafort noted that this was the first case he had seen involving a 3D-printed gun, but it certainly wouldn't be the last. As technology makes it easier to manufacture untraceable firearms, law enforcement agencies face increasing difficulty in tracking weapons used in crimes and preventing dangerous individuals from obtaining guns. The legal proceedings in this case moved relatively quickly compared to many murder cases, with Moran accepting a plea deal in August 2021 and Doherty being convicted and sentenced by March 2023. This speed provided some measure of closure for Cheryl's family, who didn't have to wait decades for justice to be served. However, the pain of their loss remains permanent regardless of how quickly the legal system moved. The different sentencing outcomes for Moran and Doherty, with Moran receiving life plus 20 years and Doherty receiving 2 consecutive life sentences plus 5 years, reflect the court's assessment of their respective roles in the crime and their potential for rehabilitation. While Moran orchestrated the murder and recruited Doherty to carry it out, Doherty was the one who physically pulled the trigger and ended Cheryl's life. Justice Rogers' statement that she believed Doherty could potentially be rehabilitated with proper psychiatric treatment was somewhat surprising given the brutality of his crime, but it reflected her assessment that his mental illness had played a significant role in his actions. The question of whether either Moran or Doherty can truly be rehabilitated remains open. They are both now in their mid-20s, having spent their early adult years behind bars for a murder they committed as teenagers and young adults. The brain development research that has influenced how the justice system treats juvenile offenders suggests that people in their late teens and early 20s have not yet fully developed the capacity for impulse control, long-term planning, and understanding consequences that characterizes mature adult thinking. However, the premeditated nature of Moran and Doherty's crime, the weeks of planning, the interstate travel with a weapon, the surveillance of the target location, and a celebration of the murder afterward, suggests that this wasn't simply a case of immature judgment or poor impulse control. This was calculated violence carried out according to plan, followed by bragging and celebration rather than remorse. For Shaylyn Moran, now in her mid-20s and serving life in prison, the question becomes whether she has developed any genuine understanding of the enormity of what she did. Has she gained insight into how her obsessive behavior, her inability to accept rejection, and her willingness to manipulate others led to the death of an innocent woman? Has she developed empathy for Cheryl Smith and her family? Has she come to terms with the fact that she will spend the rest of her life in prison for a crime she committed when she was just 18? These are questions that only Moran herself can answer, and her answers, if she ever provides them publicly, may or may not reflect genuine transformation. The prison system provides opportunities for education, therapy, and rehabilitation, but whether Moran takes advantage of those opportunities and experiences genuine moral and psychological growth remains to be seen. For Jack Doherty, The question of rehabilitation is complicated by his documented mental illness. The forensic psychiatrist who testified at his trial agreed that he suffered from PTSD, substance use disorder, and serious mental illness, though they disagreed on the exact diagnosis. Justice Rogers' statement that she believed rehabilitation was possible over the course of the very lengthy sentence that he is still required to serve suggests optimism that with proper psychiatric treatment, Doherty might eventually develop into someone fundamentally different from the 21-year-old who murdered Cheryl Smith. However, the severity of Doherty's sentence, 2 consecutive life sentences plus 5 years, ensures that any rehabilitation that occurs will happen behind bars, and it's unlikely he will ever be released from prison. Even if he experiences genuine transformation, develops empathy and remorse, and becomes a completely different person over the decades of his incarceration, the nature of his crime and his sentence mean that he will almost certainly die in prison. The case has had lasting implications for the Pawtucket community and the broader conversation about domestic violence, obsessive relationships, and the dangers posed by individuals who cannot accept the end of relationships. The Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence used Cheryl's murder as an example of how domestic violence dynamics can extend beyond intimate partners to include family members and others connected to the primary target. Leonard Trufield's experience of having his mother murdered because of his ex-girlfriend's obsession highlights the very real dangers that can result from relationship violence. While most discussions of domestic violence focus on direct harm to romantic partners, Cheryl's murder demonstrates that the danger can extend to family members, co-workers, friends, and anyone else connected to the person who is the object of obsession. The Heritage Park YMCA, where Cheryl worked, was deeply affected by her loss. The child care center where she had cared for hundreds of children over 4 years had to process the trauma of losing a beloved teacher to violence. And the families whose children had been in Cheryl's care had to explain to their children why Miss Cheryl wouldn't be coming back. The impact on these young children, some of whom may have seen Cheryl as a trusted adult figure in their lives, represents another ripple effect of Moran and Doherty's crime. The case also sparked discussions about social media's role in both facilitating criminal conspiracies and providing evidence for law enforcement. Moran and Doherty used Facebook and Snapchat to plan their crime, communicate during its execution, and celebrate afterward. While these digital communications made it easier for them to conspire from different states, they also created a permanent record that proved invaluable to investigators and prosecutors. The rapid identification and arrest of the suspects within hours of a murder, thanks in part to social media posts, demonstrates how digital evidence has changed criminal investigations. The detective who was monitoring social media and saw Doherty's bragging post just 2 hours after the murder was able to trace the location and coordinate the arrest while the suspects were still at their hotel. This kind of real-time investigation would have been impossible in the pre-digital era. However, the case also raises questions about whether social media platforms could or should do more to identify and report concerning communications that suggest imminent violence. The messages between Moran and Doherty in late December 2019, where they discussed plans to hit up Leonard and where Doherty offered to pull up and kill that person today, were sent through Facebook Messenger. Could algorithms have identified these messages as threatening and flagged them for review? Should social media companies have an obligation to report such communications to law enforcement? These are complex questions that involve balancing privacy rights, First Amendment protections, and public safety concerns. While most people would agree that preventing murders is important, there are legitimate concerns about giving tech companies or law enforcement too much access to private communications or too much power to interpret metaphorical language as literal threats. The criminal justice system's response to Moran and Doherty's crime, swift investigation, strong prosecution, and severe sentencing, sends a message that obsessive violence and targeted killings will be punished harshly. The fact that both defendants receive life sentences despite their young ages demonstrates that even teenagers and young adults will be held fully accountable for premeditated murder. However, the case also raises questions about whether the system could have intervened earlier to prevent the tragedy. Leonard Trufield's reports to police about Moran's threats, his attempts to warn authorities about the danger she posed to his mother, and the subsequent failure to take protective action all suggest that there may have been missed opportunities to prevent Cheryl's murder. It's impossible to know whether more aggressive intervention in response to Moran's threats would have actually prevented the murder. Perhaps if Moran had been arrested and charged with making terroristic threats, she would have simply waited longer to carry out her plans. Perhaps if Leonard had been granted a restraining order against her, she would have recruited Doherty to commit the murder regardless. Or perhaps early intervention, combined with mental health treatment for Moran, could have broken the cycle of obsession and prevented the escalation to deadly violence. These what-if questions are painful for Cheryl's family and friends, who are left wondering if their loved one's death could have been prevented if the system had responded differently to the warning signs. But they also provide important lessons for law enforcement, courts, and communities about the importance of taking relationship threats seriously and providing protection for potential victims even when the threatened violence seems unlikely to actually occur. The case of Shaylyn Moran and Jack Doherty serves as a reminder that age does not exempt people from accountability for their actions, and that some crimes are so calculated and heartless that they warrant the harshest punishments available under law. At 18 and 21 respectively, Moran and Doherty were barely adults when they committed murder. But their crime was not the result of immature judgment or a momentary lapse in reasoning. It was a carefully planned conspiracy carried out with deliberation and followed by celebration. The fact that they went from celebrating their engagement at a New Year's Eve party to murdering an innocent woman the next day, and then bragging about it on social media hours later, demonstrates a level of moral emptiness that age cannot fully explain. While their brains may not have been fully developed, their actions showed clear understanding of what they were doing, planning to avoid getting caught, and pride in what they had accomplished. As Shaylyn Moran and Jack Doherty served their life sentences in Rhode Island correctional facilities, Cheryl Smith's memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved her. Her family continues to grieve the loss of a devoted mother, a caring relative, and a beloved friend. The children she cared for at the Heritage Park YMCA remember the teacher who treated them with kindness and patience. Her co-workers remember a dedicated professional who took her responsibilities seriously. The community of Pawtucket remembers a hard-working woman who contributed positively to society in multiple ways. Cheryl's obituary stated that she enjoyed music, traveling the world with her brother, and most of all, she loved being a mother to her boys. This simple description captures what was lost when Shaylyn Moran orchestrated her murder, a life filled with love, joy, relationships, and purpose. Cheryl should have had decades more to travel, enjoy music, and love her family. Instead, her life was cut short on New Year's Day, 2020 by two people she had never met, for reasons that made sense only in their twisted worldview. The contrast between Cheryl's life of caring for others and Moran and Doherty's willingness to destroy life for the sake of obsession and revenge could not be more stark. Cheryl dedicated herself to helping children grow, and Moran dedicated herself to destroying anyone she perceived as having wronged her. Cheryl built relationships based on kindness and generosity. Moran built a relationship based on conspiracy and violence. In the end, the story of Shaylyn Moran, Jack Doherty, and Cheryl Smith is a tragedy that never should have happened. It's a story of obsession that should have been recognized and treated as the mental health crisis it was. It's a story of threats that should have been taken seriously and responded to with protective action. It's a story of warning signs that were missed or ignored until it was too late. But it's also a story of justice served. The investigators who worked around the clock to identify and arrest the suspects within hours of the murder. The prosecutors who built a strong case and held both defendants accountable for their roles in the crime. The judge who imposed sentences that reflected the severity of their actions and the permanent loss they had caused. And the jury that carefully considered the evidence and returned verdicts that ensured the defendants would spend their lives in prison. For Cheryl's family, no sentence can bring her back or heal the wound her death created in their lives. But the life sentences imposed on Moran and Doherty ensure that they will never have the opportunity to hurt anyone else, and that they will spend the rest of their lives paying for the choice they made to take an innocent woman's life. The legacy of this case will be felt for years to come in the training of law enforcement officers about responding to relationship threats, in the education of young people about healthy relationships and the warning signs of obsessive behavior, in the ongoing development of policies for how social media companies should handle concerning communications that suggest imminent violence, and in the memories of everyone who knew Cheryl Smith and mourns her senseless death. As we close this chapter on one of Rhode Island's most shocking murders, we must remember that behind the headlines, the trial coverage, and the legal proceedings is a real family that will never be whole again. Leonard Truefield will always carry the knowledge that his mother died because of his ex-girlfriend's obsession. Cheryl's extended family will always have a hole where she once stood. The children she cared for will grow up without the teacher who made them feel safe and valued. And somewhere in Rhode Island's prison system, Shaylyn Moran and Jack Doherty will spend their days behind bars, their youth and freedom sacrificed for a crime that took seconds to commit but will reverberate for generations. Whether they ever develop genuine remorse, whether they ever truly understand the magnitude of what they destroyed, whether they ever become different people than the teenagers who celebrated murder on social media. These are questions that only time will answer. But one thing is certain, Cheryl Smith deserved better than to die answering her own front door on New Year. She deserved to watch her sons grow up, to continue caring for children at the YMCA, to travel the world with her brother, to enjoy music and all the simple pleasures of life. She deserved justice. And while the life sentences imposed on her killers cannot restore what was lost, they ensure that justice was served and that Cheryl's death was not forgotten or dismissed. Before you go, make sure you're subscribed to this channel for more deep dives into cases that reveal the dark side of teenage relationships and online connections. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode, and let me know in the comments what case you'd like me to cover next. The story of Shaylyn Moran and Jack Doherty reminds us that age doesn't exempt anyone from accountability for their actions, and that some crimes are so calculated and heartless that they warrant the harshest punishments available under law. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay safe, and remember that obsession is not love, and violence is never the answer to heartbreak.